This is 176 Walnut Street, Newark, New Jersey. It's where I spent the first 17 years of my life. Like many Italian families, my parents had the second floor. My uncle, Canio, and grandfather lived on the third floor. And if my Aunt Maggie had wanted to, she could have had the first floor. But instead, we rented it to Joe Grandy's family. Joe was one of my childhood best friends. We lived there a long time. My mother lived there almost 50 years. When she was there, there was no indoor plumbing. The house has changed a little since then, except that the backyard is now all concrete, and my grandfather's garden is gone. Walnut Street was an ordinary street in a town not noted at the time for extraordinary things, even though Newark had been an industrial center for many, many years. However, when I was growing up, its time was passing, and a 50-year decline began as I left to go away to college. There were the Newark riots and many other things. It's sad, but true, and it hasn't really come back yet. Galante's funeral parlor has stood at the corner of Pacific and Walnut Street for almost 90 years. It still serves the community, although its suburban location does more of the funerals than its original location. I learned about death and life here, the mourners showing true and false colors at the worst of times. I saw funerals that had bands with them, and I saw people taking off their hats as funerals passed, both things that don't occur today. Ann Street was and remains a great place to learn. It shows how discipline and dedicated teachers can grow useful citizens. We went there recently to film these scenes, and it's amazing how it hasn't changed, but more importantly, the students are really learning there. My mother got me into the school against the rules. For where I lived, I should have gone to a school that was very much worse. Here's the library that I spent so many enjoyable hours and enjoyed learning from books and from my teachers, and I thank them. It's interesting how education can really help people and how important it is to make the education environment one of learning and not of anarchy. Eastside High was where I became a young adult, taught by great teachers who instilled a lifetime love of learning. They were dedicated to us and really helped us learn that we could be more than ourselves. I thank them for this, in particular Dr. Lewis, who I mentioned in the book. I found and lost a love, one I miss to this day. I've traveled far from there, but it's part of growing up, and it's an important part. And I want to thank the teachers and my fellow students for that. This is the hallway outside our homerooms. Little change from when I remember them. This particular row of lockers where I had for 3 years. I enjoyed them immensely. I enjoyed the people around them. This was the auditorium from which I graduated, never to return, but always a part of memory. I've traveled far from Eastside High, but what it gave me, I can never repay. Thank you. The Ironbound section where I grew up has changed considerably, but many things haven't. Here's Bikes. It's a little store whose sign and everything else are the same as it was when I was growing up. I spent many a lunch hour ordering a sandwich there and eating outside. It's memories like this that make it hard for me to go back, yet I do on occasion, and understand how far I've come and thank the people that shared those times with me. Here is me returning to Marcia Jenkins' building. It's still standing, still seeing residents creating stories of lifetimes. I hope these residents are happier than her mother, who made life miserable for me, who broke us up, and I hope in the end understood what she did. for I truly did love Marcia and never wished her harm. And I wish I could tell her that now. The bandstand of Independence Park has been moved from one section to another, but it looks exactly the same as it did when I was growing up. My aunts always went to the Monday night band concerts. They brought us with us, and we sat around in our little groups listening to the music. It was the era of the big band and of the American songbook, but there were also traditional favorites and there were also ethnic favorites. They played Italian, Irish, Polish, and other songs as well. Unfortunately, I Love Lucy came along, and 9 o'clock Monday nights is when it was on, and it killed a lot of things like our Monday night bandstand visits. It's a shame because it was a wonderful time for us and for the people of the Ironbound section. The church was never a strong part of our lives, but this building, now a restaurant, was where I received First Communion and Confirmation. Across the street, in a park, Stephen Leonardis, my next-door neighbor who died in Vietnam, is remembered. I remember him, and his sister invited me to my very first dance. I'm sad that he did not get a chance to live the full, rich life I did. I'm sorry for all the other boys that went off to war and didn't come back. The new church sponsored a feast every year that was the highlight of summer and harbinger of fall. It still goes on to this day, though it's in July. We missed it this year, I'm sorry to say. My Aunt Conchetta was buried from this church, but the priest was disappointed we didn't know the new Mass. Tells you what our family thought of the church, but the church still played a very important part in our lives, and for that we are thankful. And let's hope it continues to do into the rest of the century. Here is the first of my father's two laundromats. The first on Wilson Avenue is where he opened in 1951. He even sold the family burial plots to get the money to open. And he made a success out of it, even though it tortured him every day to stand on his feet. It lasted over 60 years and enabled us to open a second location, and my father to put my uncle in charge of the first when he came. And it's only in very recent time that it was demolished. The second building you see here now is where we moved, and we had our second store. This is our second house. My uncle threw my mother out of my childhood home. We fixed up the second floor and lived above the laundromat. It was where I really came from at the end. My parents lived there for another 15 years before moving to Manchester Township. My mother built a place to suit her. She even put an indoor barbecue in there. I wonder if it's still there. But the real result was that she was able to live the life she wanted to, and my father. And when they moved to Manchester Township and left Newark, I think they were both sad. It was a time of hope, sadness, and joy for them, and it was for me too. It's no longer a laundromat, but it's still there. This is my Aunt Conchetta's house, which was right around the corner from the church in which we always went when the feast was on, and who always fed me if my parents were coming home late from work. I remember her fondly, my cousins Jeannie and Anthony. Unfortunately, we had a family schism which never quite healed, and the sadness that we all felt at having our family torn asunder by my grandfather's illness. It's happened to other Italian-American families, and I'm sorry it happened to ours.